it's not considered particularly alarming for someone to suggest that an intelligence might have transcended the physical form, for example. Post-biological intelligences, these are routinely considered now. And even now people are talking about the possibility that we ourselves might be on a path on that kind of trajectory towards not necessarily godhood, but certainly non-physical, some kind of non-physical instantiation of our intelligence or of our artificial intelligent progeny or something.
Andrew.
Danny.
Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much. Good to be here.
Yeah. Thank you again for doing this. And wanted to chat with you about your new book.
Uh-huh.
I'm actually very excited about it. As I told you off camera, Reality Switch Technologies is one of my favorite books. I think it's a perfect merge between the technical world and the inspirational world as to what's to come and what's possible in this world. So I really appreciate your work. And now you have a new book out.
Yes.
Death by Astonishment.
Yes.
Right. And it comes out now, literally. It's like right around the corner.
July 1st.
July 1st.
Yes.
Today, unfortunately, we're a little limited in time. I want to kind of get to the important bullet points that I believe most people would be interested to hear directly from you versus something they can just read online. First of all, just out of curiosity, how do you prepare for a book like this? Because this, it seems like, at least from what I've, the little bit that I've read, it seems like you're reaching towards domains that don't necessarily exist completely within your wheelhouse. There seems to be like a lot of research that you've done around this, right? Do you just dive into these subjects much more in depth on top of the already surface level understanding do you have of these things?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of background research that went into it. I mean, the book starts as a very broad idea, like what am I going to talk about? It's going to be focused on DMT, which is where the title Death by Astonishment came from, obviously, but what's the story I'm going to tell? I think you need some kind of narrative structure, unless you're writing a textbook, which my first two books, well, certainly my second book was more like a textbook, in that I'm explaining complex ideas, and each chapter is kind of stands on its own, so to speak. Whereas in this book, I wanted something that was more accessible, first of all, to a more layman audience, so someone who doesn't really want to get into the weeds of the neuroscience so much, whilst also still getting the message across, and keeping it interesting and telling a story. So I start somewhere and I have to end somewhere. And so the most obvious place to start with DMT was, its forest home, right? These indigenous plant-based visionary technologies is what I would refer to them as. I think these are true pharmacological technologies. I think it's kind of a little bit unfair to call them plant-based drugs or plant-based preparation. These are technologies. I mean, these are tools that have been developed over long periods of time with this sole purpose as kind of a visual prosthesis by which these cultures can interface with these intelligences. So it made sense to start there, to give more credit to the indigenous peoples that were the first to learn how to use DMT. They didn't know about this molecule that's present within all these plants that they were using, but they are the true experts in communicating and establishing relationships with discarnate beings. So I wanted to start with that and start with the history of DMT and how we move from the forests, and these preparations are brought into Western laboratories and deconstructed. We try to make sense of them. We try to work out, what are the components of these plant-based drugs like ayahuasca or cahoba, or epina, and things like this. And then having isolated DMT in particular in this case, how we then progress to learning how this molecule works and how we might learn to use it. And so there's a thread that runs all the way back from Amazonian shamanism starting hundreds, thousands of years ago, all the way up to the 21st century, where things have changed, a lot, and DMTX and other techniques that we use to try to understand what this experience means and whether we are, in fact, interfacing, as the indigenous peoples believe, with some kind of intelligence, some kind of discarnate, advanced intelligence, whether we call it spirits or deities or entities or whatever. It's the same thing. Is there some intelligence there that somehow we are granted access to with DMT? And as you well know, I certainly lean towards the position that indeed we are interfacing with some kind of intelligence, the nature and origin of which I certainly don't claim to know anything about. But there's certainly, DMT has a relationship to humans that reaches back millennia, from the ancient to the very modern and futuristic, almost sci-fi in a way. And it's interesting to imagine how that will progress as we move into a very uncertain but rapidly developing and progressing future.
So it's something that comes up a lot, I think, in the current emerging paradigm of the usage of these substances. That first the West became aware of them, even though these shamanic traditions knew about that for. Is it true to say thousands of years, or is it more hundreds of years, by the way?
Well, there's evidence for psychedelic snuff usage, so things like cahoba, going back 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 years. I mean, there's evidence of these smoking preparations and snuff pipes and things like this. So yes, I would happily say that this is millennia old traditions.
So this was accompanying certain cultures throughout the development and the evolution of what they are as people.
Yes.
And for us, this is more of a, kind of like a thing we recently discovered, and because we, the highest value we currently hold in the Western world is, I guess, the scientific method. We analyze these substances through that lens.
Yes.
And it sounds like, and you correct me if I'm wrong, it sounds like one of the things that you're doing in the book is that you're bringing back the value of the relationship to it versus just the investigation of what it is. So it sounds like when we're looking at the traditional usage of these things, it's more around I don't want to call it protocols because it makes it, again, kind of like a lab sounding term, but it's what are the containers within which these things are used. And would you say that it's fair to say from your investigation that it actually changes the nature of the way that it's perceived as a molecule? So like the second you put it in a ceremonial container, do you feel there's enough evidence to say that it actually opens a certain kind of an interaction and an experience in the molecule space that is not necessarily available if you just kind of smoke in your living room or doing it? Or do you think that this is maybe a slightly over-romanticized idea?
Yeah, I mean, I've always been careful not to focus so much on the ritual aspects because it's heavily loaded with mysticism and religious beliefs, their own particular imprint, their own particular spiritual worldview, and I'm more focused on the science. I think what I try to do in the book is, yes, point out and show these indigenous peoples have been using these plant-based drug technologies for thousands of years to establish and maintain relationships with what they see as intelligent beings, members of their tribe who they establish relationships with and treat as being as real as the fellow humans with whom they share the forest. I mean, but of course I don't accept that that's the correct position, but at the same time, I spend a lot of time in the book showing that science has struggled and continues to struggle to do what it wants to do with this experience, which is to explain it away, which is to say, this is just a type of exotic hallucination. This is a type of dream imagery, or this is, quite common now is to describe it as neo-Jungian kind of models of archetypal structures and things. And I make great efforts to show that these more mainstream orthodox explanations actually fail, and that the DMT state remains, it is a struggle to explain. And we might be forced to reassess the assumption that these indigenous beliefs about contact with higher intelligent beings they might be onto something here, and that we might have to consider that possibility, which I do consider, and personally I think is probably closer to the truth than the it's a mere hallucination assumption. But that's a big one, for science to get behind, because they see that as an impossibility. Well, most scientists do. I shouldn't say science as if it's kind of a monolith thing, because it isn't. There are many people with many different opinions, and some of them are very open to the possibility. But what I'm saying, I don't think is far out, particularly. Well, it's far out, yeah, okay, but it's not irrational. I'm not straying that far from modern scientific discourse around, the trajectory of intelligent civilizations. It's not considered particularly alarming for someone to suggest that an intelligence might have transcended the physical form, for example. Post-biological intelligences, these are routinely considered now. And even now people are talking about the possibility that we ourselves might be on a path on that kind of trajectory towards not necessarily godhood, but certainly some kind of non-physical instantiation of our intelligence, or of our artificial intelligent progeny or something. So these things are routinely considered, and when you consider the age of life in this universe, that 2 to 8 billion years, I've heard figures. So the vast majority of life just within our universe, whatever that is likely to be far, far older than us, and likely to be incomprehensible to us, and could well exist, embedded in the fabric of space-time or something like this. And these are all, I wouldn't say mainstream science now, but are considered and speculated upon quite rationally and reasonably by mainstream scientists. So what I'm saying is, okay, perhaps there is some kind of intelligence that we can't normally see, and that is either lying parallel to or embedded deep within the structure of our reality, or perhaps in some adjacent domain that we're unaware of, and that maybe DMT does allow us to access them in some way. So initially it sounds far out, as if I'm saying, we should start believing in spirits like they do in the Amazon. I'm not saying that, but we might actually find that those beliefs are actually part of the same, we're all pointing in the same direction, which is towards some kind of intelligence that we're normally completely unaware of.
Yeah, and this is something that I think this is the line that you take, that one of the reasons I appreciate your work so much, that you're walking this very tight rope between saying things that on the surface of it to a lot of other fellow scientists sounds a little bit, like you said, out there, but at the same time you are constantly have to remind people who want it to be whatever it is, that there's still truths to be known. It's not like everything is up for grabs. There are particularities about the situation that can allow us to discern what in fact it is, even if it's of the nature of, part of walking towards godhood or things like this. There's still certain things that can either be true or not true that can help us discern what these things are. One of them is, for example, there's this big discussion happening between certain cognitive scientists where if consciousness is, either it's an emerging property or not, whether on our layer of immersion, on our level of existence, I don't know because I don't want to say universe, but like whatever it is that existence is as a whole, is consciousness substrate dependent or independent? Some people say, I think like Anil Seth is saying, well, it has to be instantiated physical matter. There's no reason to think it can transcend into just purely computational space. So these, for example, questions that have to be answered in a very particular way. When you're investigating a book like this and you're thinking about the wider audience, how do you frame that particular conundrum, if at all? Like, do you even do you think about it as a particular problem to tackle in your communication, or this is something that just you hope to emerge from the authentic approach to the question?
Well, I mean, I don't talk about consciousness too much. In fact, the word consciousness appears very few times in the book because, well, you could write, and many books have been written about consciousness from lots of different perspectives, and whether you believe it's an emergent property of the brain, whether it's the brain tunes into consciousness, or whether you think everything is fundamentally consciousness and there's nothing but consciousness. These are all potentially valid perspectives, and I don't know which is true. And in a way, it's not orthogonal to my work at all. I mean, it's obviously related. We're talking about experiences within consciousness, but at the same time, I don't need to answer that question. If that question is something that's answerable, I don't know. But I don't need to answer that question in order to do the kind of work that I do, which is to focus on what we can, the questions we can answer, like, how is the structure and content of your subjective world? How is that instantiated, right? So we know that the world that you experience, your subjective world, we don't know why it has the quality of subjectivity, but we do know that your world, the structure and the content of your world is instantiated, is represented in some way within the brain. And that's not a belief. It's quite easy to demonstrate. I mean, you can zap your brain with an electrode and cause imagery to be seen. You can cut out a part of parts of the brain that are essential for the representation of color, and I can drain color from your world. You can drain movement from people's world. People who have strokes, that affects part of the visual cortex that's responsible for representing movement in your subjective world. It's a rare condition, but it does happen. If a stroke just destroys that part of the visual cortex, then they see the world in a series of still images, which is kind of difficult to imagine what that's like. But they have a world that contains no movement. You can take psychedelic drugs, and they affect neural activity in a certain way, and they affect the structure and dynamics of your experienced world without presumably affecting the environment. So that's not a great, that's not a particularly controversial position that I'm making, is that the world you experience is instantiated in your brain. So then that means, well, in that case, if you are experiencing a different world under the influence of a psychedelic, like, let's say, LSD or psilocybin, then clearly it's that world model being generated by your brain which is being modified in some way, modulated, perturbed. But that also then means that if you are being sort of transported to an entirely different reality, the DMT world, filled with these intelligent beings, well, that means that that DMT world is also being represented somehow in the brain. That says nothing in itself about the ontology. So, I can dream about being in this room, but that would be considered, not real, in that it isn't being mapped to sensory inputs from this external environment, the reality of which we kind of take for granted.
So I guess just on that point, my question was more in the direction of, I feel like there are particular things or claims that are made in the space of psychedelics in general that put some of these more concrete questions about maybe ontologies, it's too wide, but maybe about the technicalities of how things work, even another layer of emergence. So first of all, I don't even know if that's true or not, or if it's a rumor. You'll be able to clarify. Is that true that there are, on average, many reported cases, specifically with ayahuasca, of shared hallucination or telepathy? Is that claim true, or is that too much was made out of that? Do you know anything about that?
Well, I think there are lots of anecdotal reports of. I mean, people have contacted me personally, with their kind of their trip reports of DMT or other drugs where they and another individual in the same room and literally having the same experience, or when they came back were describing exactly the same entity. One other person kind of saw the interaction between the entity and the other person who was tripping on DMT, and really kind of uncanny things like that. Now, does that mean that in the same way that the waking world is kind of mapped to this external environment, which we consider real, does that mean that your altered world model in the DMT state is also being mapped in some way to some other place? That would be how I would kind of define the reality of it.
Well, doesn't that imply that there's some substrate, some medium on which everything is kind of sitting, like versus just an interpretation of each brain individually of something,
right?
Whatever it is out there, we have some kind of. If there is a shared thing, then it's looking at something that can be looked at together. Right.
That's one explanation. Yeah. And now, of course, skeptics would say, well, maybe it's there's some kind of communication going on, subtle communication, maybe the conversation they had before the trip, that would influence the kind of experience they had. Some would even say, well, maybe it's telepathy. Maybe it's something like. I think that would be considered more plausible to many people than the idea that you're going to interacting with some, in some shared alternate reality space, some other environment. But it's something that needs to be studied, right? Because you need to have controlled conditions where you have two people that are not connected, haven't had a conversation beforehand, that don't, and to be able to kind of establish whether they are, in fact, going to some other place, or at least there is some, as you say, whether it's another world as such. I think that's an open question, or whether they are kind of, each of these individual brains is interacting with whatever it is, whether it's some kind of intelligence or some other environment, or some kind of shared information input. This is, really would be kind of a really exciting project to do, but I'm not sure anyone's actually doing it.
Do you feel like
at the moment
you're up for the task?
Probably not me personally. I'd like to see it done. You'd need. I think the kind of people that would be good at that kind of thing are parapsychologists who are very good at isolating confounding variables that most people don't consider, to ensure that we can rule out other explanations. I think a really well-controlled experiment, but it would probably be quite difficult to set up, and the experimental conditions would be quite difficult. How are you going to? Are you just going to hope that they would have a shared experience, or are you going to? How do you structure the experiment? I don't think that's an easy question.
No, it's not.
These things tend to happen just kind of spontaneously.
Yeah.
And then it's like, it's an anecdote, fascinating, and these people are probably being completely truthful. But how do you take it beyond an anecdote?
You have to have somebody paying attention to it prior to it happening, so we can kind of. I have a friend who's working on his PhD, and one of the things he hopes to investigate is there any way to potentially, so there's one hypothesis where they're like dreams, they're like waves of information moving through kind of like time zones. Mm-hmm. So he wants to see if he can set up in different labs all around the world in like sleep studies, and see if there's any correlation between the longitude or like any coordinates on Earth that kind of like there's a shared, even a vibe of a dream or anything like this that can discern some data. I mean, but those are like, the scale is so enormous. It's like the coordination of this whole thing. It's very difficult.
Yeah.
Is there something that you feel, because through everything that we do, we also grow as a person. Is there anything that you feel that you've learned that you truly like didn't know at all before you started writing the book? Now at the end when you wrote it, it's about to be published.
I probably didn't. Well, I've since I first used DMT, 20 years ago, I've I've been convinced in myself that there is some kind of intelligence there, that this world we enter is constructed by the hand of some kind of intelligence, and that we are in some way interfacing with some kind of supremely advanced, for want of a better word, alien intelligence. But I think what this book allowed me to do was not to demonstrate that as a fact, and I certainly never claim to be able to make that claim, make that assertion that it is really an alien intelligence. But what I spent a lot of time doing in the book was taking each of these alternative explanations, the hallucination explanation, the dream imagery explanation, all the kind of the standard of tools that are kind of wielded by people who like to explain the DMT state away. And I think it's crystallized for me now just how much of a struggle to explain DMT remains. And beyond that, as people will find if they read the book, it's also kind of helped to solidify the picture in my own mind of how I think it might work. And this comes from ideas that I've been working with for many years now, shifting away from the more naive idea of entering another world, of going to another reality, and focusing more on what's coming in, and that the DMT world is more of a directed world, in that this alternate source of sensory inputs, this intelligent agent in some way is gaining access. This idea of you don't break through into the DMT world, the DMT world breaks through into you, kind of flipping on its head the usual more naive way of thinking about how DMT works, the idea that DMT allows you to go to another world or to peek through a window even into another world. I think that's completely on its head. I think actually in reality DMT is gating access, is granting access to your brain, to
that information rushes in, so to speak.
Exactly, there's it's hard to demonstrate that, but there are a number of both scientific studies that would suggest this. So a recent study out of Imperial which showed that that DMT induces this state where the brain is highly susceptible to external perturbations. So it's much more responsive. If you stimulate the brain with some alternate source of sensory inputs or whatever, the brain reacts much more strongly. So it's very, very sensitive. It's this very kind of fluid and dynamic and malleable.
So it implies the gates are open.
Right, exactly. And means that the brain is much more, so it goes from being very rigid to being malleable and to being manipulatable, one could even say.
Is it not true with LSD as well?
Yes.
It makes it like super hyper-connected. Yeah.
Right, so with all the psychedelics, you see this to a certain extent, which raises the question of what's special about DMT. And but DMT, I think, seems to be unique still in some ways. Why? Why does DMT so reliably induce entity encounter? Is it just the degree to which this neural state and the efficiency and intensity, the level to which this neural state is being reached with DMT? Or is there something peculiar about the patterns of emergent neural activity that are generated in the presence of DMT? I'm not sure, but I think that that picture of information coming into the brain when the brain is kind of vulnerable in a way to being commandeered. I mean, you can imagine it. It's like this intelligent agent is commandeering temporarily your brain's world-building apparatus, and using your brain. Your brain becomes like the stage. You're not gate crashing a party, you're hosting it, basically. And there's a sense in many of the DMT experiences of a kind of a performance. It's a party, and they're kind of showing off. They're showing you what they can do, and they're controlling everything. they're controlling the visions quite clearly. And sometimes they will show you screens and things and with wild things going on. And it feels like, if they're controlling the experience, in my mind, that means they're controlling your neural activity. Because it's your neural activity which represents the structure and dynamics of the experience. And there are indigenous peoples that kind of understand this implicitly. So there's a tribe called the Piro, I think they are called, in the Peruvian Amazon, who have who communicate with these beings they call Kayiglu, which means the ones who cause visions to be seen. So they understand these beings don't have, in their mind, a kind of a true visual form. And they are unable to see their true original visual form or their true form in any kind of way. But these beings, they cause their visions to be seen. Now, they don't understand the neuroscience, but in my mind, for an entity to cause the visions to be seen means an entity that is manipulating your neural machinery and is manipulating the visions and manipulating how your brain constructs the world.
It's like they're gaining access to a private server and they get to play on top
exactly.
of it, basically.
Exactly.
Huh. I heard Bernardo Castro mentioning this a few times, that there was some research, actually I think he said in every research that was done on these things, that it shows that actually psychedelics reduce the activity in the brain. Is that correct? So that kind of goes against what I'm hearing from what came from Imperial with LSD, that it seems to be like hyper-connected, so it seems to be more active. Is there obviously there's nuance to this, but
there's nuance, yeah. I mean, so what he's referring to here is the very first psilocybin study, which was done by the Imperial team, fMRI study. I mean, first of all, lower brain activity, a neuron that's switched off contains as much information as a neuron that's switched on. It's like a 1 and a 0. So the fact that certain parts of the brain are becoming more quiet doesn't imply reduced consciousness or anything like, or reduced information or anything like that, or doesn't force you to invoke something beyond the brain going on. So that's the first important point. The second is that when they did subsequent studies with LSD, they found activation. And I think there was some discussion about that first psilocybin paper and about perhaps how the data had been acquired or interpreted, and that perhaps with this later LSD study they'd kind of ironed out those problems. And so we know that psychedelics, they bind to this 5-HT2A receptor, which is an excitatory receptor, which means it makes the neuron more excitable, more likely to fire. It's stimulating. So you would expect to see stimulation, not necessarily globally, but you'd expect to see overall higher activity, and more areas of the brain lighting up and indeed speaking to each other. So whereas you go from this very tightly orchestrated, coordinated brain activity where some parts of the cortex light up together and then they quiet and then other areas light up, and it's kind of this shifting from state to state in a very tightly orchestrated and controlled manner. And you go to a state in the psychedelic state which is much more fluid and dynamic, and that's a breakdown of the normal kind of rigid networks of the brain, and parts of the brain start speaking to each other that weren't normally speaking to each other.
That's the case with DMT as well?
And that's the case with DMT. But what you see with DMT, which is kind of interesting, is, well, there's a number of things that are kind of interesting. But in terms of the neural activity, as I see it, a lot of the psychedelic experience more generally can be mapped to this change in neural activity. The world becomes more fluid and novel and less stable in the psychedelic state. And so you go from a state of order to a more disordered state. Carhart Harris calls this an entropic state, the entropic brain theory, as he calls it. So you're moving from order to something closer toward, not into the chaotic realm, but into this subcritical state that's close, that's more disordered than the normal waking state. But what happens with DMT, which I think is more difficult to explain, is not the initial shift towards disorder, but then this collapse into what is quite obviously a highly ordered alternate reality. It's not simply a more disordered or fluid or dynamic version of the normal waking world that you might expect to see on a low dose of another psychedelic, but it is a clean transition to an alternate world that is often more ordered in many ways than our world, but just as coherent, just as meaningful, but completely different, with no relationship whatsoever to the normal waking world. And so I'd like to see more studies looking at that. There was some Chris Timmerman, who did the DMT study, fMRI DMT study, and the EEG studies as well. He noticed that there was this, what he described as the emergence of order amidst an ocean of chaos. I think he words like that. I forget the words he used, but you get the idea that there was this, in the deepest levels of the DMT state, there seemed to be another order emerging that you could see within the electrical signature of neural activity that they were getting on EEG, which suggests to me that indeed, yes, the brain is somehow finding a new order. You go from order to disorder, and then down to a completely different but entirely new order. And that's really the great mystery, is how the brain achieves that.
As a heuristic, how close would be the situation in a cymatic pattern, where you crank up the frequency and the Chladni plate goes from one standing wave to chaos and then to a higher level standing wave? Is that too much of an oversimplification, but there's some correlations there?
There could be, yeah. I mean certainly, as a heuristic, and if that helps you to kind of understand how it's working, then yeah, I think so. But I don't think we understand, what's going on. I mean, I would posit that it's that the shift to this new order is indeed the point at which the information is it's just like with a radio set, where you have you're on one channel and you nudge the dial out of tune and it becomes very disordered, just crackling white noise, and then finally it's like an entirely new, crisp, clear channel kind of crackles through the speakers, and that's the point, of course, at which you're receiving the information from this alternate frequency. I think the radio antenna, it's overused, and it can sometimes lead people astray, the idea of tuning into other worlds. But I think kind of it works, right? That's the idea that I'm talking about, the idea that the brain becomes capable of receiving this alternate information source. That would be the point at which the alternate world crackles into view in the DMT state.
Yeah, I think the radio holds a little bit, like you're right, well, for me it sounds like a better example. And there is this pushback that sometimes people give to the whole image of, it's a very Aldous Huxley example, right, where you just like, it's a receiver, the brain is a receiver. But the counter argument to that is what you mentioned yourself, which is like, how can you, if that's the case, how can you explain that if you damage one part of the receiver, all of a sudden this ability goes away, and yet if you damage the whole brain at death, all of a sudden you're again fully coherent? But I actually think the radio example does make some sense of it, because in terms of the architecture of the brain, it would make sense that there's particular arrangements of the physical matter that creates the antenna the way that it does, allows for certain functions on this level of coherence. But if you go to this other level, then because you don't really even know what the logic there needs to be, then it looks coherent enough to interact with whatever that is through whatever architecture you have currently. As a final thought, if you would have to imagine, forget about right now, like let's just let the imagination run wild. What do you see as your kind of like optimal vision of a healthy humanity? I don't know, maybe 100 years at this point is kind of too far to postulate, but maybe 20 years from now, 30 years from now, how do you view like a healthy society in relationship to our understanding of these things in our minds? Is it more of these shamanic traditions in terms of the respect that we pay to their ways of doing it, all around like how you organize communities? Is it more around the kind of research we're entertaining? Like, do you see these technologies infused in society as a whole? Like, do you see a mainstream situation where, people can just go to any like a little local place, and they can just lay down and have their trip with like a full-on. Would that be included in that?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not a sociologist, so the kind of the community stuff, it's not really my bag. I mean, but in answer to your question, yes, I do see, and I talk about this, I write about this in the book, is I think once society begins to, I mean, this is really the huge problem we have, is that at the moment, people are extremely resistant to the idea that we could be dealing with some other intelligent being that not only exists, but with which we can establish and maintain some kind of relationship. I think that should be the aim here, not so much questions about, what's your ontological status and can you solve this mathematical problem for me. I'm not talking about kind of testing them, or getting them to kind of prove their existence to us.
They might not be interested.
I'm sure they have no interest in proving themselves to us.
Yeah.
But I think once we accept the possibility that we could be dealing with some kind of intelligent agent, then the next step should be, well, how do we establish a relationship with them? Can we establish a relationship with them? Is it possible for people that humans in the future might spend significant portions of their lives in communication in some way with these beings, whether it means extended DMT trips where, as you described, lying down perhaps in a pod for hours or longer. You can imagine this kind of thing going on for days or weeks, where you'd lie down, all of your bodily needs would be taken care of.
Oh man, I really want to try that.
And either they inject you with DMT, or as we're thinking about now, the next iteration of DMTX would be eDMTX, which is endo-DMTX, where you hack the brain's own DMT biosynthetic mechanisms to actually elevate naturally.
How do you do that? Magnetic stimulation or a combination of things? Or?
Well, we think that there's a peptide in the human brain that kind of keeps DMT levels low. It inhibits DMT production. We're working at the moment with the team at the University of Florida to isolate and establish the structure of this peptide and how it's hooked into the regulatory system of the brain. So if we can hack this system, we might be able to naturally, someone might lie down in a pod and then they may be injected with an antipeptide or something like this that would then gradually induce them into the DMT state, and they would perhaps remain there for long periods of time, establishing communication, establishing relationships with these intelligences that are perhaps more advanced than us, and perhaps that's how we progress as a species. It's not by going to Mars. These kind of seem to me as a massive failure of imagination, the idea that we're just going to be colonizing Mars and setting up Walmarts on Mars or something and just kind of replicating the Earth.
Come on, man.
I don't know.
You don't want to Best Buy on Mars?
I know.
No, well, my question was, I think, a little flimsy, but you filled in the gap that I think it was missing. My question was more around I guess what I had in my mind was around exactly what you just said, which is that there seems to be a certain trajectory to what scientists can comfortably explore, as long as the rest of society accepts certain tenets about reality. Right?
Yeah.
Because that feeds into like funds and all of that stuff. So my question was more around that, which is like, is there a vision you have of a healthy society that entertains these things seriously, and what kind of research trajectories this might give rise to, and just to maybe give a middle ground vision that I think to some extent you and I share, but I actually think that the reason that we see all this untapped real estate out there in space is a hint that it's almost like, if you think of it as a video game, right? So there's this, I don't know if you ever played like RPGs or whatever, but like you always have this, like you're always first playing in your local neighborhood, like you're playing in a city or whatever, you're doing whatever missions you got to do, and then when you solve enough of those, the map opens up. Now you get access to this other thing. So it seems to me that it's almost like we're looking at two maps, right? We're looking at the external map, which is all this empty space, and we're looking at the internal map that seems to be, now we know that is populated by some kind of weird creatures. And I don't think it's a coincidence. I think that whatever we see outside is to some degree a reflection of what's inside, and we didn't open that last mission with to solve in our city yet. But the second we do, something tells me that something will happen in our inner space investigation that would make sense of all of a sudden we're going to go, aha, oh, I see how we can traverse 1,000 light years now. I get it. And then you merge these technologies together. Now, obviously, this is like a super sci-fi, vision. But I was wondering if, because I listen, I'm one of the reasons that before I knew you, before anything, like when I read your first book, one of the things that really excited me is that people, like smart people, actually allow themselves to think in such fun ways. That's why I really appreciated about alien information theory. So I know you have pretty wild ideas. So I guess I was trying to get like, do you have like the wildest vision you can imagine? Do you ever think about like, what would that look like in 20, 30, 40 years where we incorporate these understandings into who we are, what we are, and how we do things?
Well, I mean, in that first book, I describe the whole process as being like a game in a way, and I still generally think of reality as being some kind of game, and whether there are levels. I mean, if you think, what's going to be the next grand paradigm shift in our understanding of reality, could that be facilitated by something like DMT? Is it something that opens up, as you suggest? I mean, I think that's very much a possibility, but it's impossible to kind of speculate what that might look like. It's just like it's impossible for a classical physicist in the 19th century to imagine quantum theory or relativity even. It's like perhaps it's currently beyond our comprehension, and so to speculate that we might enter a world or there'd be a paradigm shift that leads us into something that is currently beyond our comprehension, I think is beyond our comprehension.
All right, so no Walmarts in hyperspace. They're like, well, you got to get permits. It's very difficult to get a permit in 5 dimensions. All right, well, we can. That's a beautiful note to end on. Then I wish we would have more time, Andrew, but to be continued. We're going to do this again if I ever visit Japan. We'll do a fun one. I want to thank you for everything you do and for taking the time. And yeah, man, keep doing the amazing work. It's highly appreciated by many individuals, including myself. So thank you.
Thank you, Danny.
Absolutely.